Hello, my fellow debaters, and welcome to another Debate Legend YouTube channel video. Today, we'll be talking on the point of ethics on whether life is inherently meaningless. We'll be debating this great point, this great question against the beginner bot on debatelegend.com. Let's get right into this. So, our opponent here, Spectacular Seashore 656, which is a beginner bot, which is one level higher than Noob, says that while life can seem rich with experiences and emotions, when examined from a broader perspective, it lacks inherent meaning. The universe operates without a guiding purpose, and human existence is but a fleeting moment within an indifferent cosmos. Our personal quests for meaning are subjective constructs, often tied to societal norms and individual desires, not universal truths. Acknowledging life's inherent meaninglessness can empower us to create our own purpose, embracing the freedom to define what matters to us personally, rather than seeking validation from a non existent grand design. So, I think what we can argue here is that by saying that each individual person should find meaning, we're embracing almost entirely the idea that life must therefore have some meaning for each individual to find. This, in other words, can be rephrased to say that life is inherently meaningful. And that's something that we can argue. Now, also, I'd point out that of the three pillars of happiness, as defined in psychology, you have enjoyment, you've got satisfaction, and then the final one is meaning. People do need to find their own meaning, and our opponent is acknowledging that. But the very existence of a meaning to find institutes that it must be inherent. So I'm going to go ahead and type that out. Give me a minute. I'll be right back. Alright, so we're back. I've made the argument that while the content of meaning may be arbitrary, the fact that each individual, as my opponent has already stated, can find it implies that it must exist. Let's submit this and see what my opponent has to say about that. Alright, my opponent responds with, while it's true that people find meaning in their lives, this does not imply that life has inherent meaning. The ability to create personal significance stems from human consciousness and creativity, not from an overarching purpose embedded in existence. Each person's unique sense of meaning is a testament to subjectivity, not evidence of an inherent universal meaning. The very diversity in what individuals find meaningful underlies the absence of a singular intrinsic meaning to life itself. So this is certainly interesting. However, what we can argue here is what my opponent is trying to say is if you can't define meaning because it's so subjective, well, it mustn't exist for each individual. But we can point out, say, the concept of personality. Personality is unique to each individual, yet it still exists. It's entirely subjective, and yet it exists. We can define a category of things, rather, as meaning, and say that each individual person can find that meaning. That doesn't mean it's the same thing for everybody, but it does mean that it's there. Let's get to writing. Alright, so now that I've clicked submit, we'll go ahead and take a look at the analysis. Alright, what do you know? I win again. The debate on whether life is inherently meaningless was argued by my opponent and myself. My opponent started off with the argument that life lacks inherent meaning when viewed from a broader perspective. They contended that the universe does not operate with a guiding purpose and that human existence is simply a fleeting moment within an indifferent cosmos. Furthermore, they argued that the meaning people find in life is a subjective construct driven by societal norms and personal desires, rather than universal truths. This perspective encourages individuals to create their own purpose, emphasizing personal freedom. I will say, for this topic, that is definitely a pretty good opening argument without evidence. You'll notice that throughout this debate, neither me nor my opponent really used much of that evidence. And especially when you're talking about ethics and philosophy, you don't always have to do that. You might want to use something maybe a famous philosopher said, or something that an expert on the subject has said to enhance your ethos, but as a general rule, you don't need to. On the other hand, I countered by arguing that life must have inherent meaning for individuals to be able to find meaning at all. I highlighted the fact that encouraging people to find meaning implies the existence of an inherent meaning for each person. While acknowledging that the content of meaning may be arbitrary and vary across individuals, I argued that the ability to find meaning suggests its existence. Now, I did something here that you'll definitely want to probably use in your debates, which is that if you're going to lose a point, lose it, but lose it well. What I did here is I conceded that, yeah, the content of the meaning is definitely going to be arbitrary. However, the meaning is still there. By conceding the point of content being arbitrary, I've basically made my position a little bit more defendable. You don't just want to argue everything that your opponent says. The judge is going to look at who is more reasonable. If you can just change your stance slightly, do a little shift, that's a lot better than defending something that you're going to lose. In my opponent's rebuttal, they maintain that the ability to create personal significance does not imply an overarching purpose embedded in existence. They posited that human consciousness and creativity are the sources of personal meaning, and that the diversity in what individuals find meaningful supports the idea that there is no singular intrinsic meaning to life. I responded by reinforcing the idea that finding meaning, even if subjective, indicates the existence of that meaning. I drew an analogy to personality, which is subjective and varies across people, but still exists for each person. I argued that just because meaning is subjective does not mean it doesn't exist. For a lot of less experienced judges, analogies are really helpful and really useful. If you can relate or simplify this issue to just something that you'd see in your everyday life or something that makes sense, like for example here, meaning is a pretty broad topic, but bringing it down to just personality, a concept that a lot of people understand, you can make it seem like the issue is really simple and thus make your side look like the winning side. Simplifying is really good in a lot of cases, but if your opponent is also a good simplifier, you might find some difficulty there if they can combat your analogy, so you want to make sure that it's rock solid. Now, if your opponent does pull one of these simplification moves, what you can do is try to find some way that their analogy doesn't really connect with what you're saying and what you're debating about, and that's going to help you to overcome that analogy and then also look like you're winning the debate as a whole. Overall, I presented a stronger case by effectively addressing and countering my opponent's arguments. I successfully argued that subjectivity in meaning does not negate the existence of inherent meaning and used the analogy of personality to reinforce my point. My opponent, on the other hand, while coherent, did not sufficiently refute my points about the existence of individual inherent meaning. Thus, I win. So that's another thing that you can take advantage of on at least debatelegend.com. If you have the last word in an argument, that gives you the opportunity for free reign over what you want to say. If you have to be able to combat each and every point your opponent makes, though. If you miss a point in the last part of the debate, the judge is going to pick up on that and you're likely going to lose. That's why it's important to weigh the pros and cons of going second in a debate. Alright, well, that'll be all for today. Hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions, make sure to leave them in the comments. I'll make sure to put this and the link to this debate in the description. Goodbye.